create that custom event. Now, one more important thing you need to understand, that is we need to know about another concept related to components. That is, you have to understand the component life cycle. So that's what we need to understand about the components as a last in the component concept. Generally, people call as life cycle hooks. So, right. So technically, it is just life cycle actually. Component life cycle is nothing but actually the components that we are using. Every component undergoes several phases. There are various phases of component. So even you don't define those phases, internally those phases will execute one after another for component. Technically, a component starts, destroys. So technically, component starts, executes, and destroys. So destroys memory allocated for it. Actually, component have few phases, and these phases are managed by the Angular library, Angular framework. Actually, Angular creates a component on request. So after creating component to the request, it renders the component to the client. It renders the component to client. Next step, it verifies the changes in properties and values in component. That means it identifies the changes in component properties and values, changes in component values. Then it updates the changes, and finally it will destroy the memory allocated for component. So technically, a component starts, executes, and destroys. So generally, every component comprises of few phases. it will undergo those phases. That means you are compiling a component, starting with a component. It will undergo these phases actually. In these phases, it will undergo several events that I will show you what are the various events, actually how it undergoes those events. Technically, so how the component handles everything. See, generally, the client request comes to a component. So when the client request comes to the component, it undergoes several phases. First, it creates the component. After creating the component, it will render the component to the client. Now, when any changes are made in that component, so those changes are identified. That means changes are identified. Changes are identified. After changes identified, it will update the changes. Update the changes. After updating the changes, it will render those changes back to the client. After rendering back the changes to the client, then finally it will destroy the component, the memory allocated for that component. This is actually the basic cycle it undergoes. The major phases here: creating component, rendering component, identifying the changes, updating the changes, and destroying after render complete. Once the component is sent to the client, it is destroyed. It is destroyed. So generally, this is the basic cycle, how it actually works. In this component cycle, every component uses various events. That means every Angular component handles the functionality, of cycle. You can simply say that life cycle. Every Angular component handles the functionality by using following events which are known as life cycle hooks. Actually, people call them as life cycle hooks, but better to say as life cycle events. That means every component undergoes some events. So better to say life cycle events. What are the life cycle events? That means how it will process everything one after another. Actually, the first thing happens in a component is a constructor is called. That means